mentioning earlier, I've got about 5 hours worth of material. I don't know how long we have the room for.
I
hope you've booked the day. Joking apart, though, I'm not too sure where the conversation is going to lead us this morning for the next 55 minutes or so. But we'll let the discussion try and guide us. And Ignacio already sort of mentioned something to me that he would like to hear about.
Just to inform you, Raphael, you have here 4 students, which is a great people that can contribute to your presentation.
Absolutely. No, come back, stay. So, yeah, my name is Raphael Costambeys-Kempczynski. As you can tell, it's a typically English name, and English, British. And I've been, teaching for nigh on 30 years on and off. And then I spent 15 or so years in management at university level, and began getting interested in the student experience. Where are you from, the 4 of you? Are you from?
Which university?
Which university are you from?
We are.
Oh, you're here, University of Paris Cité.
Mm-hmm.
And what year are you in?
Second year.
Yeah.
Okay. There's been historically a lot of confusion around the definition of the term student experience because of the ambiguities of the word experience, which is both ambiguous in English and in French. In French, it's loosely translated as l'expérience étudiante, as you would expect. So I thought what would be interesting to start with is just trying to think up of definitions of these terms that seem similar and are often used synonymously, but are codified in different ways. Student life, campus life, and student experience. And I thought we'd try and start with defining what student life is, or rather than use the word define, try and codify it. Because it is codified by law. But laws are made by people like you and I. So I was wondering whether we could, so I've set up a Jamboard. I don't know, can everybody see the Jamboard? Can I see the Jamboard? Can you see the Jamboard? No.
That's it's like a white. Okay.
Can you see a Jamboard there?
Let me click on the link here. Yes.
Can everybody online see the Jamboard? Yeah?
But we all have view only access.
No, because you need to write.
Yeah. Okay. So then I'm requesting you to.
So if you can't write, do.
So we need to join also to get the link.
The link.
Yeah.
And use share it, I know. Yeah, and we need to get access.
I'll put the link in the chat.
We know that access to it. Yeah. So he's just he's gonna get it. That's the hope.
So I have last year in the area, only year already. You need to get to it. Can't see any of you apart from Roy. Can you see it, Jamboard? Do you think?
Because I can see Olivier.
No, the access is closed.
And you connected with your.
Yeah.
I can edit it also.
Yeah, you should be able to edit. What do you do? You should be able to edit.
Yeah, I think one needed to follow the third link that you sent, which is sharing, or the second one, I don't remember, 1, 2, 3.
The very last one, yeah.
I'll just refresh it.
You want me to refresh?
No, again.
Alice.
It was to the list. You don't.
No.
No, I sent a request, but this is individual basis. You.
Okay, let's see what I'll do. Who wrote Jamboard up?
Olivier, of course.
All right, I'm going to start again now everybody's connected on. I'm going to start a new Jamboard. Let's see if this works. I used to do this all the time during the pandemic. Never once had a problem. There we go. I'm just going to give you.
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm just going to make you all editors.
Still not beautiful.
It's coming, it's coming.
Okay.
Is it the last thing that we take now? Is it? Okay.
That should be everybody with editors' rights.
Yes, we can modify the scene, so.
You should be able to.
Okay,
Do you?
maybe share and click on this share with learning small thing there, and then viewer, we put it top, and now we should be able to edit. Everybody on the Jamboard will be able to edit. Okay.
Super. Everybody on the Jamboard? All right.
Can you send again? You just shared again the link. Oh, and
That's
All right, the exercise is simpler, I hope, than the use of the technology. Again, yes, so the idea is that we see if we can codify together what student life is. So you can use it, you can try and codify it either experientially as from the perspective of a student, or from the perspective of a researcher, a teacher, or somebody in management, whatever perspective that is perhaps most familiar to you today. All I'm looking for are keywords, right? Keywords for you that help constrain, define, codify what student life is. The idea over the course of this discussion is trying to understand how these different notions work at an international level and then are applied at a local level here in France. Okay. Just a couple of minutes.
so should we use this?
And then use the stickers. If you use the post-its, it's probably easier, like Olivier did earlier, and just post it. Just one keyword per post-it would be perfect. And no, don't censor yourselves. Whatever comes to mind.
Oh, no. No.
You okay?
Yeah, refresh it.
whatever come to our
Never sense yourselves. And try not to censor other people. So don't put your post-its above other people's post-its, right? On top of other people's. Sorry. This is student line.
Sorry.
I'm terribly sorry for the person here. Who wrote eat, sleep, sit in, class, repeat?
Olivier.
And that's your life today, isn't it? That's what you do today. Stuff like, oh dear, oh dear.
I feel when you're a student, you don't sleep. Only in classes.
You sleep in classes, but perhaps the early morning club because classes start too early. But truly, man. Do you not find yourself going to bed late and having trouble in the morning?
Yeah. Yeah.
So all he did is making his post-its bigger than everybody else's. Discoveries. I have the power to throw people out. No money. Oh, I'm going to put that in. Okay, the activity's slowing down a bit, so just to read through the post-its very quickly, we have activity, club, party, socialising, which I've sort of grouped together, even though socialising is a complex notion, perhaps that goes beyond obviously partying and to different social clubs. Friends, interesting, share, eat, sleep, repeat. There's the question of international students, the course, no money, work. Don't know what type of work, whether it's university related or whether it's having to finance the studies. Suffer, really sorry about that. Let's see what we can do about that. Amphitheatres or lecture halls, learning, evolving, life choices, discoveries, internships. Yeah, associations in the French sense of the term, associations and activity clubs. All right then. Now, what I find interesting here is that there are the post-its that I've put towards the right here. Learning, amphitheatres. We could add the question of sitting in class. Discoveries, of course, has sort of multiple values attached to it, because it could be intellectual discoveries, so discovering your intellectual passions, as we call them, with regards to the subjects that you're studying, but it could also be other experiences that you're discovering as you're entering early adulthood. Internships, of course, tend to be linked, not always, but tend to be linked with the learning trajectory, with the learning journey as well. These aspects tend not to be codified with regards to student life per se. But we will find other aspects that are apparent here. So if we talk about student societies or activity clubs or association in French, or more generally civic engagement, if we talk about the fact that you don't have any money, so we're talking about grant systems, perhaps, or accessing student loans, for instance. These aspects are currently codified in what we consider to be student life in general. And in France, there is one student life operator that you have touched upon. Who mentioned the CROUS? Of course. All right. So if we come back to
The CROUS for the restaurant of the CROUS.
for student catering.
Yeah.
Well, this is interesting because in actual fact, in French law, there is one student life operator, and they're not universities. Now, what was interesting in your post-its is that there were all the post-its grouped towards the right of the screen, going from learning to amphitheatres to sitting clubs, etc., all relate to life as students on university campus. Universities, in French law, are not responsible for student life. Only the CROUS. Okay. There are what the French call 6 fundamental missions for higher education establishments in France, and of those 6, student life is at one of them. I mention this because there's currently lobbying going on in favour of adding a 7th fundamental mission to higher education institutions in France, which would make them also responsible for student life. So this is how the law stands today. Okay, and so this is le réseau des œuvres is CROUS, okay, because CROUS is Centre Régional d'Œuvres Universitaires Scolaires. And this is lifted from the Code de l'Éducation, so the law that governs education in France. And this is the codification of student life and the fact that student life is given over, the responsibility of student life is given over to the CROUS. Favoriser l'amélioration des conditions de vie étudiante par ses interventions dans les domaines, notamment l'accompagnement social des études, leur financement, money, simply put, right? So financing studies, restauration, student catering, that's why Ignacio mentioned the CROUS, housing, logement, health, mobility, somebody mentioned international students, all right? So there's the question of also the important question of housing international students, cultural activities, sporting activities, and student initiatives. So this is the student initiative relates to civic engagement. So student life is codified in French law and its responsibility is given over to the CROUS. Except that in 2013, the French, as you know, the French universities are, how can I put this, have been asked over the course of the past 10 years to sort of group together, okay, according to sort of regional logic. So for instance, for the students here at the University of Paris-Cité, you may or may not know that it was created after the merger of Paris 5, Paris 7, l'Institut Physique du Globe de Paris. Okay, I'm not forgetting anybody. Right, so this was part of this general movement over the course of the past 10 years to bring universities together, to make the make it more understand or to try to make the higher education system in France more readable, both at a government level and at a student level. Is that the case for you? You're comfortable with the name of your university, you know the name of your university, yeah? You feel like you belong to your university?
Maybe not as much as students in other countries, because we were here at CROUS, and I think more attached to the Queen identity than the university.
I think we're first like student of the degree and then student of the university. However, we have sometimes like extra activities in the chemistry lab. For example, we had 1 or 2 classes, but it's rather exception than we don't feel belong.
Okay. I think that's absolutely fine that you feel members of CROUS before you feel members of the University of Paris. I think we all have sort of sense of belonging works at different levels, and we belong to different communities depending on the time of day, depending on the people we're with, depending on a whole variety of factors. In 2013, as the different higher education institutions were being asked to group together, they were also asked by territory to develop a strategic plan with regards to student life in collaboration with the CROUS. Right? And these were called Projet d'amélioration de la qualité de la vie étudiante et de promotion sociale. Right? So it's the working on the quality of student life and social advancement. Right? I'm just translating it into English, because it's not social promotion, it's social advancement in English. Right? And these documents there's meant to be one document per territoire, which is basically per French region, roughly. And so for instance, I was one of the lead writers for the Ile-de-France, and the document looks something like this. I need to share the screen. If you have to see that. And so the idea here was to try and define student life actions at a regional level for a multi-year strategic plan. Okay. Why I'm mentioning this is because what we can see is that we have student life codified at a national level with the CROUS, and then attempt here to instruct institutions to define student life at the meso level, at a regional level, but still not at campus level. And so we're still not here directly attributing questions of student life to universities and giving them over to university responsibility. Right. And just because Ignacio earlier was asking me, how can we start quantifying questions with regards to student life, student experience, campus life? What was interesting here is that we began creating cartographies of student life infrastructures across the Ile-de-France region. So here you can see in the middle, you've got a cluster which you would expect. This is the Latin Quarter in Paris, but you can see here the spread of infrastructures across the region. And the reason why I'm just pointing out this just to show you how interesting it is when you start creating these cartographies or these maps of student life infrastructures, is that you can see that there's this one tiny blue spot in the middle of the yellow and green clusters. Right? So there's a high concentration of students. The blue spot represents a health centre, a student health centre. So it just goes to show what helps show here where perhaps there's a lack of student services when there's a high concentration of the presence of students. So here we have lots of different university campuses and one student health centre. Whereas you can see the spread of student health centres across the region. So we can sort of start thinking about how we might develop different infrastructures depending on where students actually are, where they live and where they study. Of course, it also helps change public transport routes, etc. So let me come back to presentation. I'd just like to know what would be the difference then between student life and campus life. We can come back to the Jamboard. What I'll do is I'll put your student life post-its over to the left, and if there were things that you feel are specific to your life, to questions of campus life with regards to student life, you can post them up on the right there.
We have to move the post-it, we think, or
No. You post-its on the blank side of the screen that you think differentiate student life from campus life, or the extra elements that you would want to add in if you were codifying what campus life was and how different it would be from student, or what the difference is with regards to student.
what is specific to campus life.
Yeah.
But that could be part of students' life.
Could be. Everything's in the modal. Shared cadence, that's really interesting. We put shared cadence. Meeting. All right. So we have strict housing, university libraries, conversations with teachers, meetings with teachers, resources, places where to study, read, interact, share cadence. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for that. The reason why I paused, especially when Ignacio said could, use the modal could, is because the definition of campus life in France is causing some debate. Because there's there's a sense, there's those that believe that when we talk about campus life, we're no longer just talking about students, but also includes academic and non-academic staff. So it's going to be the infrastructures and different activities that exist on campus that are addressed to the whole community. And then there are others who say, well, in actual fact, the difference between campus life and student life here is we focus on student life on campus. It might seem like something that's, well, you know, why put this up for debate? It doesn't really matter. We can include the whole community, and etc., which is true. Except that the students pay in France a contribution when they register, which all four of you have paid, called la CDEC, or la contribution à la vie étudiante et de campus, which is 90 euros. It's obligatory. And of those 90 euros, 45 euros go to the CROUS and 45 euros go to your university. And that money can only be spent, as the law describes, on campus life, une contribution destinée à favoriser l'accueil, l'accompagnement social, sanitaire, culturel et sportif des étudiants et à conforter les actions de prévention et d'éducation à la santé réalisées à leur intention. Right, so here it's directly for questions with regards to student life on campus. And this changes.
Is there, so how does it translate to digital? Like, because in COVID, was it, when you say campus, is it the physical campus or is it?
No. No, so the COVID situation was an interesting one because all of a sudden, as perhaps you realised here, you were no longer on campus and you were at home, and teaching was done online, but not all students were equipped to learn online, not physically equipped, right? Didn't have computers, didn't necessarily have a stable connection to the internet. So university managers turned towards the Ministry of Higher Education saying, how can we finance buying this equipment for our students, right? So that they can learn from home and they have access to a computer and access to the internet. And the response was, well, you have the CDEC to finance this. Okay. But of course, the CDEC was also financing a whole load of other things, including student initiatives. And within those student initiatives, there's what they call the FSDE, which is the Fonds Social de Développement des Initiatives Étudiantes. It's divided into two categories. Right? You're financing student initiatives with regards to student activities through, for instance, student civic engagement, but we're also financing some social actions, right? So sort of basically offering students mini grants through this one. Well, during COVID, all of a sudden there were this extra spending that had to be done with basically the same budget.
So 45 euro per student.
Yeah, so it's 45 euros per student. Now, the idea of the law is that it's not, it doesn't work like a license fee. It's not because you pay 45 euros, right, that you get 45 euros back in student life amenities. It means you contribute to the general sort of student life, whether it's today or whether it's projects that will be put in place in 3 years' time. So it operates like a tax rather than a fee. That's the intention. Right, let's move on to how we distinguish between student life, campus life, therefore, and student experience. I'll put up three terms here: student experience, student learning experience, and total student experience, because they all belong to the same family. And the use of the term total student experience came about during the Quality in Higher Education project in 1992, which was led by Alison Burrows, Lee Harvey, and Diana Green in the United Kingdom. in the United Kingdom, right? Now, 1992 is a very important year in the development of higher education institutions in the UK, because this is the year of the Further and Higher Education Act. And this particular act, the main point of this particular act is that it transformed what we called at the time polytechnics, which were technical higher education institutions, nothing to do with Polytechnique in France, okay? These were considered to be institutions that offered technical training, okay, that often were seen, if we sort of do a class analysis, of being of a lower standard than universities, right? But in 1992, 35 of these polytechnics, 35 of these polys became universities, or new universities, or indeed new universities, because this was the third generation of new universities over the history of universities in the United Kingdom. And these new universities became universities thanks to the Higher Education Act of 1992 and not thanks to Royal Charter, whereas before 1992, all universities in the United Kingdom became universities because they were given a Royal Charter to be a university. So all of a sudden, bigger number of universities in the UK, the creation of HEI, which is the Higher Education Funding Council of England. So there's a new structure here to fund universities in the United Kingdom. And it introduced the necessity to secure provision for quality of education assessment. The quality of education here is going to be extremely important, because if you have to secure provision for quality of education assessment, it means that we have to learn how to measure the quality of education. Not student satisfaction, but the quality of education. So we're not asking you, for instance, to tell me whether you're satisfied with your classes, but whether you think you can measure the quality of those classes. So the QHE project in 1992, what they did then was they took all the literature that existed in that sort of dealt with the idea of how to identify quality criteria and different measurement criteria that were used by these different bodies that existed in the UK at the time. There's plethora of them, or there was plethora of them. And what they did was they read through all these literature and they identified 111 criteria that were sort of defined to help measure quality of education. And then once they've identified these 111 criteria, they address them to students, teaching and research staff, and non-teaching staff. And they ask them simply to rank them. Not an easy exercise. If I asked you today to identify what's the one top criteria that for you is a measure of the quality of the education you receive.
What is your student experience?
No, the quality of education.
Okay, that's the criteria. Is that what you're saying?
Your criteria is the quality of the student.
No, I was wondering, the question was more about the quality of your student experience rather than the quality.
No, so here the question was asked to rank these 111 criteria in order of importance with regards to the measurement of the quality of education. If you had to give me one criteria.
Instructional design, pedagogy.
Ah, instructional design. Very interesting. So I put in at number one, because before working on the questions of public policy in higher education, I used to work on popular music, so I had this sort of this mindset of charts. In at number one, here we have the aims and objectives of the programme are understood by staff.
Thinking about that.
This is in 1992. So if we're talking about design or instructional design, the question of the program is that the program is understood by staff. No distinction here between teaching staff, research staff, or non-academic staff, or non-teaching staff, right? Staff in general. This is 1992, and what strikes me when I sort of go back to this, this initial document that's 30 years old, is that today I still work and have discussions with teaching engineers, pedagogical engineers, who are accompanying colleagues in designing different syllabuses or syllabi and curricula, okay, and trying to sort of like format what a syllabus is and trying to format what a curriculum is. Right? This isn't a criticism on my behalf, it's only not natural that these discussions continue because they're organic. They grow and they develop and they evolve as teaching methods grow, develop and evolve, as student needs grow, develop and evolve. Okay, but it's still, therefore, hot news. Okay, how do we define and format a syllabus? How do we define and format a curriculum? And then, of course, once the format has been defined, then it becomes something that's shareable. You can see here the top, you've got the top three. So the first, it's no surprise, quality of education, that the first criterion is one that's, that comes in the teaching category. Then the following two are institutional resources. Adequate access to library facilities, and library has adequate resources to cater for the learning demands of students. And this again is vitally important. Okay. So this basically means that there are enough books on the library shelves for students to share that are on the bibliographies of the courses being taught, rather than, for instance, books that I would buy for my research, or that I'd get the library to buy for my research.
Olivia has put in a comment. Did anyone create a postmodern syllabus generator, one that would reduce the understanding of staff?
I think we could, I'm sure we could do some code, Olivier, that just generates syllabus. You put in 3 or 4 keywords and it just generates postmodern syllabuses. That are probably nonsense, but that appears to make sense. Okay, so we have in the top 5, we have 3 different criteria that relate to library resources. And then just number 4 is at the bottom there, just to complete the top 5, is assessment. Right? Assessment methods are valid, objective, and fair. And what's interesting therefore in the top 5 is that we have the starting point that the program is understood by staff, and we have the end point that the evaluation seems valid, objective, and fair. Okay.
But how is it relevant to anyone who's not a student? I understand, like maybe like the assessment one.
Okay, because it's going to depend on what we're assessing. All right. So if we move on, I'm going to move on. We're going to bring in these different elements as conversation develops. What we find is 111 criteria. Remember, so when we start hitting around the 90-odd mark, we're at the bottom of our charts, and here it's going to be elements with regards to research. That's what we find, right? So it seems logical, okay, that when we talk about quality, measuring quality of education, that questions of research come at the bottom of the ranking. But it's not that obvious at university management level, where priority tends to be given to research activities in this idea that these research activities will filter down into our education activities. And this is a sort of an eternal problem. And here, questions of content, which I've identified here, all in the top 20. The academic standard or level of the program is appropriate to the award. Right, so this is again relates to measurement of well, basically the marking scheme, doesn't it? So whether the evaluation is objective and fair. The content is designed to achieve program aims and objectives. So we're back again with this idea of syllabus and curricula. The program content inspires students and gives them confidence. So this relates to intellectual passion. And the program content has a coherent sequence and structure. Again, back to program, curriculum and sequence. What we find here is that never at any point is the question of measuring the quality of the content an issue. Right? It's systematically how we access the content that is highly ranked. And so what the authors started realizing is that what both students and staff and other stakeholders, such as employers, what they're ranking high up is the students' engagement in the learning process itself. Not necessarily the content that's being acquired, not the knowledge that's acquisition, but how the knowledge is acquired. And this is why they introduced the term experience. So it's not the experience of the partying, the socializing, etc. It's the experience of being part of the process. Today, we probably talk more about co-construction than anything else. And so it's not surprising that the question of feedback is highly ranked, because closing the feedback loop, of course, means that we're engaged in this sort of very circular process. It's ranked fifth. It was ranked fifth, the fifth most important criteria by students, and ranked 10th overall. So earlier I said it depends what we're requiring in response to Roy's question. For employers, the nature of the content was ranked low down in the scale of what corresponds to, or how one measure quality of education. Right, so what we're going to find highly ranked are questions of skills and attitudes, rather than content-specific knowledge. Right? So we're not talking about speciality subjects. So the single most important item for academics and employers was the ability to communicate effectively. This was 30 years ago, it's still true today. Teamwork, I love this, teamwork, which the employers ranked in second place, with 75% indicating that it was essential, was 12th for the academics, and only 39% indicating that they regarded it as essential. But even students didn't regard it as particularly essential. Do you work in teams? And employers ranked specialist subject knowledge last, with a mere 17.8% indicating that specialist subject knowledge was an essential quality when selecting graduates for recruitment to their organisation. Indeed, more than a third of employers, 38%, regarded it as little or no importance. One would imagine that this doesn't concern medical doctors, right? Okay. So here, this is what we find in the top 20. Right? Communication, critical thinking, problem solving, analytic skills. So we're not here considering specialist subject knowledge at all, but very much students' engagement in the learning process. All right, but this was 30 years ago. What's happened in the past 30 years? So there's been a couple of societal revolutions, internationalization to begin with, and the digital revolution. There's been one major societal evolution, that's sustainability consciousness. And there's been one social evolution at student level in France, which is major importance, is that now 1 in 2 students in France work between 50 and 20 hours per week on a regular basis. So somebody put money as an issue up on the post-it. So what we're finding is over the course of the past 30 years, what's happened is that we've gone from students being full-time students doing part-time work to a point of balance now where we're not sure whether students are full-time students or part-time workers or full-time workers and part-time students. Right? And it's not slowing down. So now we're starting to think about, well, what happens when the majority of our students are in actual fact part-time students and working full-time?
This paid work doesn't include internship.
It depends on the internships, but it's not a factor, to my understanding, at least, it's not a factor that that upsets the balance of this tendency.
This is more including people doing additional work or programs that are based on alternance.
Yeah, well, at least it incorporates both non-relevant and non-subject relevant and course relevant paid work. But we're also talking about seasonal work. We're talking about all sorts of different in paid work. So the number of hours that internships represent with regards to the total number of hours worked by the total student body in France is doesn't upset the balance of this particular trajectory, to my understanding. Yeah, just to close the loop on the definition of the total student experience. The total student experience encompasses teaching and learning, curriculum, student life, advising and mentoring. More recently, however, the focus has shifted to the evaluation of the total student experience, which would include issues such as the facilities available with institution relationships and the academic staff and fellow students, and attitudes towards the teaching style offered by lecturers and tutors. Somebody talked about meetings with teachers. It's of course a very privileged thing that needs some consideration. Increasingly, students' attitudes and perceptions towards the institution as a whole are seen as central issues in determining the total student experience, and achievements are derived from the total student experience while in higher education, whether academic, extracurricular, or work experiences. So what we understand here is that the central core of the total student experience is the learning experience, but to learn as an experience means to engage in the learning process, and engagement in the learning process therefore includes a whole number of different factors that are curricular and extracurricular, and are curricular and co-curricular, but also relate to different aspects of student life, housing and catering, access to cultural facilities and sporting facilities, etc. And all of this belongs to the total student experience. And this was the conclusion of the QHE project, is that it's impossible to measure the quality of education as something that solely exists within the classroom, because engaging in the learning experience requires us to understand what's going on with regards to engagement in the process, what we call commonly today student engagement in English. Engagement means something very different. Student engagement, and that engagement is constructed for the majority of that particular experience outside of the classroom. So let's have a look at what's happening in France, or what's been happening in France over the past 30 years. So in 1994, the sociologist Françoi Dubet had a look at student experience, and he tried to fit it within the French context. And this is the definition that he sort of came up. So he said, so in French, chaque étudiant définit son rapport aux études selon trois grands principes qui renvoient aux trois fonctions essentielles de tout système universitaire. Right? So students define their relationship with their studies according to three principles. or what Dubet identifies as 3 essential functions of the university system. The relationship between the diploma and the job market, socialisation, and I suppose what one could call critical analysis or critical skills. And he goes on to talk about the ideal real student, ceux qui se définissent comme portés par un projet professionnel, par une vocation intellectuelle et par une forte intégration dans le milieu universitaire et étudiant. So the ideal real student is already constructing a future employability, a professional project. You know what you're going to do when you finish your studies? You do? Well, we've got one candidate as an ideal real student. Intellectual passion. I would imagine you're driven intellectually by what you do.
Yes.
That's what I always tell my students. If your teacher asks what appears to be a rhetorical question in class, always say yes. Just say, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Did you read the book for today? Yeah. And you feel members of your student community. You mentioned this earlier, it doesn't matter what level, but you belong to a particular community. Of course, this isn't the case for all students all the time, and this is why he talks about an ideal real student and understands that it's not particularly the case for everybody. But why does he talk about the 3 essential functions of the university system? Well, because once again, this is what I was mentioning earlier, the university system and its missions are codified by law, right? So there are 6, as what I said earlier, there are 6 missions that are given over to the responsibility of higher education institutions in France. And these are teaching and learning, or actually education, formation initiale, research, employability. So la diffusion de la culture humaniste, I'm not too sure what that means, but no, yeah, okay, so this is having our sort of humanist vocation. Participating in the construction of the European, I feel very misplaced now to talk about this as a British board, but of Europe with regards to higher education and international cooperation, right? It's at one point in this these 6 sections, this is quoted from the law, okay, is the word student étudiant mentioned. Yes, here we have question of education, but that's it. There's no, as I mentioned earlier, there's no mention of student life, there's no mention of students. And so there are lobbies in place trying to change this. So that was in 1994. In 2011, the sociologist Aziz Jellab has another think about the student experience in France. And so he's starting to think about it with regards to successive generations of policies that are trying to massify, open up, democratize, if you like, access to higher education in France. And it's what we commonly called la massification de l'enseignement supérieur. And he tries to equate the questions of massification with socialisation, understanding that our concern has to be the students. And yes, okay, so it's a great thing, of course, that we can offer access to higher education to the maximum number of students. But when we are, as an individual within a crowd, this doesn't necessarily mean that we feel like we belong to a group, and it can have the effect of isolating us from others. And this is detrimental to the student experience. Yeah. And this is something that he sort of touches upon here, about how this massification leads to us feeling anonymous, whereas, of course, our job is to construct an environment that allows for socialization. But he comes to this conclusion then, so if we move from the first generation of total student, of this idea of the student experience in France, which is Dubet, trying to equate the reality of student engagement with regards to how the university system in France is codified. With this second generation, this is Aziz Jellab, who's sort of starting to think about these different logics of socialization and how we can link socialization to engage student engagement. And of course, again, when I talk about student engagement here, I mean engagement with the learning process, the learning experience. And so the second generation articulates academic concerns with intellectual passion, civic and political engagement, co- and extracurricular activities, while engaging with such complex issues as socialization and identity construction. And what's interesting with the term engagement, of course, is that it means when one is engaged, that one engages one's personal responsibility. And this is always something that must not be forgotten in the definition. Okay, so that's what's happening in France. Just to take a step back and have a look at a wider international context, these are colleagues, if I'm not mistaken, from Australia, who have a long tradition of working on public policy with regards to student experience, and who categorized, therefore, in 2009, the whole variety of different aspects that concern the student experience, from student factors to sectoral factors, external factors, institutional factors, and of course, outcomes. Just to give you a sense of the complexity of the map itself. And so to come back to the talk of today of the third generation approach to student experience policy, this is where the literature seems to be pointing to where we're at. So I've named it ARC, as I said in previous meetings, because I like to do a bit of marketing, agency, resilience and co-construction. There's three factors today that are helping us frame a new generation of student experience policy. That's just me working my. There's I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking about. I think I'm going to move on here because I'm taking into consideration how we can try and develop new mapping tools today, whether they're questionnaires that help us reevaluate the measurement of the student experience, or whether they're criteria that help us create new cartographies of the student experience. Next couple of schematics are in French, but they're just to give you an idea of the different categories that have been identified of student engagement, right? So there are different levels of student engagement that have been identified, as you can see on your screen here: spectators, participants, organisers, leaders, and agents of change, right? And although the arrow seems to suggest that there's a progression, as if you start off in year one, you arrive, you're a new student, you're discovering the place, you're just there as a spectator, and then in year two, you're a participant, in year three, you're an organizer, and then in your last year of your master's degree, you're an agent of change. That's not how, in actual fact, that's how it works, right? So the idea here is that we can be spectators and agents of change, or leaders and organisers at different moments of our university journey as a student. And in actual fact, you can come in year one and be an agent of change because you're involved in a student society at the management level of your student society or whatever. And then in year three, because you want to graduate and you spent your first year busy with your student society and you've got classes to catch up, you might stop everything and just become a spectator again because you're concentrating on passing your undergraduate degree. Right? So,
the levels of engagement are, I have the impression, are very specific to certain aspect of the student experience, but because for instance, these ones, because for learning tasks, let's say during a course, you will not be, you may not become a leader during the classroom, no?
Okay, so the first, yeah,
Concerning the curricula, the teaching. And there is other models to think about engagement in learning tasks. That is, for instance, passive, active, constructive, interactive, etc. So,
absolutely, all right. And often you can map these different categories on top. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they're redundant, sometimes they're not quite redundant, sometimes there's specificity. But there are, as you rightly point out, there are ways of translating this into learning activities, which we practice today. So you can, if you're doing project-based learning activities, then you're going to have to encourage a leader, an organizer, right? And then what I'm interested in focusing here on is the question of agents of change, because this is how we identify questions of agency. And there are very simple exercises that we practice to try and identify what agency is as an ability that we can then sort of communicate to our students. And that is, for instance, saying, oh, you're not all going to stay behind the pillar, are you? And seeing which one's the first one to stand up and encourage the others to move across. Right? All right, so the difference between the question of agency is influencing, is the ability to influence your surroundings and not being subject to your surroundings, right? Or not being subject to the structure. Okay? And this is true as your engagement institutionally in your university, but it's also true, as you point out, it has a learning value as well as how you engage in the learning process and how you might engage in the classroom, how you might engage in the learning activities, etc. And so this chart, this schematic here, which you've had perhaps a bit more time to have a look at, is just to try and point out that yes, at different times, different moments, you can belong to different categories, and indeed all categories at the same time. This is what postmodernism teaches us. How does it translate in the reality of the way government structures exist today? Well, for instance, the Times Higher Education has a survey which they call the Student Experience Survey, which combines a number of criteria which try to engage both or articulate both the learning experience with questions of student life. Okay, so we have high quality staff, lecturers, helpful and interesting staff, but we also have here, for instance, questions of the good environment on campus and around university. And so we're going to combine access to staff and teaching staff, whether or not there's pastoral care, you can go and talk to your academic lecturers, and the price of a coffee or a beer in the local bar. And so CHE has developed this survey with different categories that are weighted, and this survey is then sent out to the students across the United Kingdom to answer, and then universities are ranked. And this ranking is followed by students. Right? This is something that's of particular interest. The problem is, from a scientific point of view, is the left, the respondents, the left column here on your screen. Is the total number of respondents across all universities in the United Kingdom. Right, so that means that sort of hidden, you've got one university for which there were 69 respondents. And one can imagine, of course, that those who do respond are either very angry or very keen, but not necessarily the middle ground. So then, what the
So in this survey, do you have questions concerning, let's say, for the agency part, students' feeling of being able to become leaders or something?
There's nothing that specific. This is, I mean, it's well done, but it's not a research tool. So it's one could suggest it was more the marketing. But here, what we did have though in 2014 is we had the publication of this particular research paper, okay, called Improving the Student Learning Experience and National Assessment. And what's interesting here is that the number of respondents aren't necessarily greater, but what was interesting here is that according to different categories, so here we're going to have library resources as a category, the one that I'm showing here, because it arrived in 1992 in the top 5 of the QHE project. It was mentioned here on one of the post-its, all right? Library facilities and library resources are of vital importance. And here you can see there are 6 indicators that have been identified. And what you have is you have a blue line and a red line. The blue line is the value of provision assessed by managers, and the quality in red, you've got the quality of provision assessed by student representatives. So you can see where they meet, which means that both are on key, on partner, and where they diverge. And what's interesting here, as a former HEI manager, is that where they diverge means that here there is scope, of course, for improvement and reassessing where we invest our budget and how to improve facilities for the student experience. My concern here, and what's a shame here, is that this is a static document published in 2014. So there's no way of closing the feedback loop. And my desire is that we manage to develop a dynamic tool of this that allows us to measure this diachronically across time, and that we have a sense, therefore, of how we're improving the provision towards students and bettering the student experience. And just to give you an insight of what's happened over the past 30 years is the creation of student experience senior management positions, notably with regards to vice presidents, vice provosts, pro-vice chancellors, or deputy vice chancellors that have the student experience portfolio. Not the student life portfolio, it's the student experience portfolio. And you can see here, for instance, we've got teaching, learning, and student experience combined. And what we're also starting to see develop is the student and staff experience. Just to give us, again, a sense of community. So yeah, just what I wanted to do this morning is to give you a sort of a general overview of sort of the 30 years of public policy with regards to the development of the question of the total student experience, where we were in 1992 and what we're perhaps moving towards here today, 30 years later. And that's it really. I've got loads more things that we can discuss, but I'm reiterating things. If I've got 10 minutes left, maybe?
Yeah.
Because these just give you some case studies, all right? The question of typologies, which I'm insisting upon here, because French universities don't really know their students, right? So there is a question of trying to understand who our students are, so that we can try to start designing a sense of community, not to mention a sense of belonging. Right? this seems to be an important aspect that we need to look at. Case study number 2 is the question of civic engagement. How many out of the 4 of you do you belong to association? Never belong to association? Have you ever been engaged civically?
What does it mean?
Well, you volunteer. Have you ever volunteered to do a civic activity?
Yeah, you wrote that this week.
So if we come back to the knowledge, skills and attitudes that were identified in the 1992 project as being vital for assessing the quality of education, we can note that these attributes tend to be acquired outside of the classroom and can be acquired through activities of civic engagement. And there is this push, therefore, for universities to recognise their students' civic engagement within the course structure of their curriculum. So you can get credit, for instance, with CTS, because you're a member of a student society or an association. And this is now law, okay? This has been law since January 2017, if I'm not mistaken. And with the case study is the question of mental health and well-being. I think might as well touch upon this. I know some of you are particularly interested in this subject. And this, I think, is again of absolute vital importance with regards to how, as universities, we create environments that help foster a learning environment that is faith-based, right? Especially when we factor in a certain number of statistics that we are perhaps familiar with. 75% of all mental illnesses begin before the age of 24, have begun by the age of 24. Depression is the 4th cause of illness and disability, and suicide is the 3rd cause of death among 15. Very much focusing on the student category. In France, 75% of OCDs begin by the age of 25. 600,000 cases of schizophrenia, which are usually diagnosed between the ages of 15 and 24, and depression doubled from March 2020 to March 2021, which is perhaps understandable because of what was going on. And the question, of course, that we have to ask ourselves: what responsibility or what comes under the remit, if you like, of the university to take into account or into consideration these different factors. Outside, of course, or beyond creating more health centres and recruiting psychologists, etc. And this is something that some of you are already familiar with. So Laurier Schreiner, who's a colleague in the States, who developed what she calls the thriving quotient, how we measure how students thrive, talks about psychosocial well-being and identifies five-factor approach that universities can engage with. So engaged learning, academic determination, social connectedness, diverse citizenship, and positive perspective. Now these 5 categories are something that, yes, universities can perhaps engage with, whereas, of course, the medical factors, it's a different ministry, it's the Ministry of Health, right? We can collaborate, we can work together, but here we're focusing on what universities can engage in directly. And that's it, just for those of you who were saying that students don't sleep. We sort of just, this is sorry for those of you who already heard me mention this before. So some neuroscientists talk about the adolescent brain. The adolescent brain is the development of the brain between the ages of 10 and 25. Okay, so it takes into account the student years. And through the development of MRI scanning over the past 20, 30 years now, neuroscientists have been able to sort of look more closely at the way the brain develops over this particular period. And been able to identify that on average, there tends to be this sort of 3-hour jet lag during the adolescent period of maturation of the brain. So the adolescent brain starts to feel tired on average around 11 p.m. at night. So this is 3 hours later than what we would call the adult brain. Requires 10 hours sleep at night rather than 8 hours sleep at night, which happens later on. So as I pointed out here, asking an adolescent brain to learn at 9 a.m. is equivalent to asking an adult brain to learn at 6 a.m. And in France, most secondary school classes begin at 8:30 and university teaching begins at 8 a.m. So this is like asking you to start, or asking me to start learning at 5 o'clock in the morning. If you're in class at 8 o'clock. I don't want to, I'll put here, I don't want to fall into scientism. I don't want to sort of project upon the student population, received ideas that I could perhaps conclude from a brief reading of MRI scanners and their these sort of things, and work towards something that's prescriptive. And most serious neuroscientists say there's something to do here with learning, but we need to experiment. Okay, we cannot conclude preemptively, if you like, just from the scanning. We need to do real life experiments. Very difficult, though, to put into place. At school level, it's very difficult to go up to the school board, for instance, and say, look, we've got this research project. What we'd like to do is we'd like to start classes later. Now, this is going to cost a bit of money to put into place, and we might be wrong. So we're going to actually we're going to have to explain to the parents that we're going to experiment with their children by starting classes later, but then we're going to have to come back to the old system. Even if we're right, we're still going to have to come back to the old system because then things will only move on incrementally. It might be easier to practice this at university level. Okay, what's stopping us in actual fact saying, well, no, we're not going to start classes at 8, we're going to start them at 10. And we'll compare the end of year results with the previous end of year results and see if things have progressed or not. And there might be a whole variety of different social factors that come into play and that help, create different points of stimuli that help the mark progress. But at least it's an initial experiment. But then, of course, it also costs money because we're going to be tweaking the university infrastructures, including how you map out student timetables, the use of university campuses, and the time at which I go back home to feed my daughter. So it becomes a very complicated state of affairs. So it's as if the school day and the university day is not designed to help you learn, but it's designed for me to live my life in a practical fashion. But this might be something that we can test out. So this is a question of resilience. This is why I'm concluding on this. I'm concluding on ARC. Co-construction. This is another idea that stems from these MRI scans and trying to understand the sort of psychosocial behaviour of the adolescent brain, but without, again, it's very important not to be prescriptive here, okay? Because there's this sort of impossibility of experimenting with these questions, and so it's very important that we're very careful with the way we sort of evaluate this and conclude upon these different aspects. But these questions of logics of socialization and of individualization versus socialization with regards to the way student communities function might sort of have their value in project-based learning, okay, if we're entering into a logic of co-construction. And so without being preemptive again, the idea here is to say, okay, what seems to be suggested is that the adolescent brain is sensitive to the presence of peers and the evaluation of peers. Okay, so this is why you can spend, the adolescent brain can spend days, the whole day socializing with other adolescent brains, and then when it gets home and is confronted with a parents, the adult brain just goes and locks itself away in the bedroom and doesn't want to talk to its parents. But perhaps again, this can be fed back into sort of project-based learning, team learning, etc. And the question of agency. The adolescent brain seems to be more akin to taking risks in the presence of other adolescent brains. And again, without trying to be prescriptive here, risk-taking can also mean creativity. And this is interesting with regards to creative pedagogies. How can we use this to help develop a sense of agency through creative learning? And these are just tendencies that we can start thinking about and practice. And it's 1 o'clock.
When does it start? Implement.
It'd be interesting to see if we can try and test something out here at LPI.
It's a nice ecosystem to
Yeah.
experiment.
It's a good level to work at, and there's and you can combine both a sort of the teachers as researchers approach, but also students as researchers approach to sort of feeding back into that. There's a couple of things that are interesting here to work on it. I think at university management level, we need dynamic tools that help us evaluate the learning provision that we afford our students and that we don't have today. For that, we need to know our student community. So we need to develop tools, but then there are learning experiences that we also need to look at. Try to practice. But we really need to sort of take the innovation leap when it comes to pedagogy. We talk a lot about innovative pedagogies, but we've been taking baby steps, but we need to practice taking big leaps at some point.
Thank you very much. Apologies for looking. It's just I think that's something which we could redo because you do have like actually 5 hours. So maybe a different version of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming. Thank you for staying.